continuing really from yesterday when I tried to emphasize the call for having not only the fleshly birth as we all do, but to have a spiritual birth. It gets expressed, especially in the Christian tradition, as to be born again. In the Indian tradition, it is generally said to be twice born, meaning much the same. And of course, what does it mean to be born again is an important question. To be born of the Spirit. And as I also mentioned quickly yesterday, in India, this has just simply become now a caste label. Dvij, if you are a Brahmin, so you're already twice born. Nothing needs to be done anymore. And similarly, there are many people in the Christian context who regard themselves to be born again. It's not so easy. And also, I just want to mention here that there is a great deal of literal-mindedness that gets attached to that. This person who I mentioned yesterday, Nicodemus, who came to Christ, who makes this remark that he needs to be born of the Spirit. Now, Nicodemus literally in Greek means ruler of men. So already he's supposed to be at a fairly higher level in the society, and he's a member of the council. But look what he actually says. You can see this in the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel. When Christ asks him to be born again, he says, how can an old man like me re-enter the womb of his mother to be born again? This is a direct quote from the Gospel of John. You can look it up. So you see that literal-mindedness is so common. It's very much attached to the whole idea of Christ being the virgin birth. Even the canonical Gospels, they all mentioned that when he, especially when he was very stridently speaking to people in the synagogue, they say, what about your brothers? They are referring to his brothers already. You can see this in the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of Matthew. So he already has brothers, older brothers and sisters. His sister is called Mary. His brother is called John. They are named. So then to say he has a virgin birth, that Mary was completely a virgin when he was born. You see that literal-mindedness is so frequent, so common everywhere. So I invite you to think of this, what we understand by spiritual birth. And I had just this, nobody necessarily has to agree with this. Most people don't agree that the so-called midlife crisis, in my judgment, is actually an internal wish for a spiritual birth. Having been already born, and in India it gets more or less classified that the first 25 years you are learning, and then next 25 years is sort of supposed to be one of the stages in your life in which you're earning, taking care of the family, etc. And the 3rd stage is said to be really now more and more spiritually oriented. So that is the way it is said to be. But even there, as I just said, it has now simply become a caste label to be that I am twice born. So I'm still continuing with what are common features of the great traditions, the 2 traditions that I have mentioned, the Abrahamic traditions and the Indian traditions. Frequently, they get labeled as Western and Eastern traditions. And the reason for mentioning some of these common features are that there are many, many common features, and that if we wish to understand something about the other traditions, we need to see what are the differences. I'll focus on the differences starting next time, but I'm still continuing with many common features. One of them is, obviously, that there are different levels of reality, and that for each level, some of you have not heard me say that earlier, but many levels of reality subtler than the mind. That is almost the very meaning of something being spiritual. But that spiritual level itself is very large. As a simple example, there are 9 orders of angels in the Bible. They're all spiritual at different levels. Similarly, in the Indian tradition, many devas or yakshas are at very different levels. And then that each level requires appropriate instruments. simple remark of St. Paul, eyes of the flesh see the things of the flesh, eyes of the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. So how does one develop eyes of the Spirit? This is the reason why frequent remarks of Christ, you have eyes but you do not see. You have ears but you do not hear. And there is always a suggestion that at this, we end up using the word higher levels. This is actually very much of a Christian orientation. In India, one would more or less say deeper level. Because if you look at any of the spiritually oriented paintings, etc., from India, they're always sort of like concentric circles or triangles. The notion there is that ultimately it's deep within us that God needs to be searched, not God up there in heaven somewhere. So, but we still end up using the word higher levels. It will be probably preferable to subtler levels, including both higher and deeper. Whatever. Language can itself be a little tricky. But then, very strong suggestion that those who can see at the higher level, very interesting remark of William Blake, when the door of perceptions are cleansed, everything is seen as it is, infinite. We see this kind of remark from very great scientists. For example, Einstein made this remark that there are really only two ways that people look at anything in the world. One is that it is all completely full of mystery. There is nothing but mystery. The other is nothing is mysterious. So, there are two different attitudes. And then very strong suggestion in all teachings that higher the level of one's being, or if one is connected with a higher level of perception, higher level of being, then one is more and more freed from some usual laws. This is what leads to what are called occult powers, because the so-called occult powers, because they are people, those who are advanced, they are free of some of the laws which bind other people. Very simple example, at least in my case, I suspect it may be true for most of you. If somebody calls me in the morning a son of a bitch, what you say is so terrible, it stays in my mind for a long time. I'm not free of this. But I have known personally some people who could be criticized in the morning, but they're still happy to have them sit for lunch with them. They're free of that psychological law, which I am not free of. So what I'm saying is that more advanced a person is internally, by advanced I don't mean having more paychecks, obviously, more free they are of the laws. So the call actually is to be lawless in the spiritual world. This may seem strange to people, but here is the remark of St. Paul to the letter to the Galatians. If you're guided by the Spirit, you're not under the law. So you see, to become lawless, that's the call. To be more and more free of all the laws that are running the world. And freedom from the law really is an indication of a higher level of being, and therefore, more or less naturally, certain powers are there, which we would call occult powers. The Sanskrit word is siddhi. Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, particularly in the 3rd chapter, very much emphasizes how one thing or the other can lead to this kind of siddhi or that kind of siddhi, all sorts of powers. But always a call from people, from all the sages, not to get so fascinated by these powers, to remain a little free of them. In fact, for example, I even remember a conversation with Krishnamurti. I don't even know what, I wasn't especially asking him about this, but he said, they say that I used to have some healing powers. which he, of course, never denied. On the other hand, he was not necessarily trying to emphasize this or asking people to come to him to be healed. And in a way, actually, one of the, more or less, the only sarcastic remark of Christ in the Bible you can read is when he says, saying, you fools so fascinated by the miraculous powers. Children of, forgotten his actual expression, very strong expression actually. So in a way, all the teachers, great teachers or sages have these powers, but they are not usually at all anxious to be people running after them for these particular powers. And very strong suggestion, the natural tendency is to call these a supernatural power. But according to all these sages, and it is more emphasized in India, that these are also natural. By natural, they mean extraordinary, to be sure, but we don't know everything about nature. All we know about nature is not all there is to nature. This is actually St. Augustine's remark a long time ago. I often remind people that everything we now teach in physics was unknown 135 years ago. So we need to give some credit to our physicists that in the next 135 years they will discover something, or maybe 1350 years they will discover something. So nature is much larger than what we know of nature. That is really the only point to be made here. And that these powers are still natural. They are not beyond Prakriti. They are not coming from the divine side. They are still part of nature. Another feature common to all the spiritual teachers is that there is a purpose to the existence of each human being and purpose to the cosmos. And that human birth is not accidental or incidental, and that the call is for us to search for what is the purpose. Why am I here is really one of the fundamental spiritual questions, very intimately related with who am I and why am I here. These two go more or less together. And here, let me remind you what is the overall scientific perspective about it. Steven Weinberg, somebody had the other day mentioned quantum mechanics, I've forgotten who was. He's a great, highly regarded scientist, especially in the field of quantum mechanics. He wrote a book called The First 3 Minutes, which is very highly regarded in physics circle. This is his remark. He describes the Earth as a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. And then he concludes, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. See, from the scientific point of view, the whole creation began from the lowest level of consciousness, and somewhat incidentally, accidentally, things have come together, life has begun, consciousness has emerged, but there is no purpose to this. There is no meaning to this. Therefore, it is all accidental. One needs to be very clear about this because everybody is so fascinated by scientific discoveries, quite understandably, really, in a way, they are quite miraculous discoveries. But one needs to remember, especially if you put the symbol from the Christian circles, the whole symbol of the cross is really a call to relate with the vertical as well as with the horizontal. The whole scientific work is to do with the horizontal axis. And more fascinated one is with it, more one is not at all involved with the vertical axis. Because search for the vertical axis, according to all the teachers, by vertical axis here really I obviously mean connection with the highest level of being, with God, it requires a search inside. All scientific search is outside. Even when we try to discover other people's minds, what's going on in their heads, it is still discovering other people's minds and heads, what is going on in their head. Spiritual search is internal search. That doesn't mean that one needs to be against the external search. That would be completely silly. But from a spiritual point of view, very soon the suggestion comes that Prakriti or nature is absolutely endless. So if you get so fascinated with it, you can spend next 1 million years finding more and more and more. Whereas internal search requires deeper and deeper understanding, connecting with subtler and subtler levels. And therefore, sooner or later, the advice generally is to more or less turn your attention completely inward and not get so occupied with what is taking place outside. But there is no suggestion, and in fact, I should here emphasize this is something very much more significantly actually coming from the Christian tradition than it does from the Hindu tradition. Very much a call that we need also to take care of this planet. For example, the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom be here as well as in the other world. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This has very much influenced some of the sages in India in the 20th century, particularly Aurobindo, who in fact was very critical of Shankara, saying all this world is just illusory and we should relate with the subtler world or the higher world. And Aurobindo's whole program was to spiritualize the material world. This is his expression, not my expression. To spiritualize the material world. And again, sometimes I actually felt this even about Krishnamurti. He would say, you can give up your job or this, which is strange, because one needs to also undertake one's attention on the planet to take care of this earth. And very strong suggestion that we are children of both heaven and earth, and that both parents need to be honored and respected and taken care of. It's much more emphasized in the Christian circles than in the Indian circles. But then, I think this has been said by me several times already, because it is to be emphasized again and again, in all of these teachings, very strong suggestion that ultimately what we need to do is to find our oneness or our unity with the source, with the home, with God. So oneness with the one, if you like, that is the call. The Buddha saying, look within, you are the Buddha. And it is certainly much more emphasized in the Indian tradition. There are 4 what are called Mahavakyas, meaning the great enunciations from the Vedic tradition. Maybe I quickly mention to you what those 4 are. One is, I am Brahma. Secondly, you are also Brahma. Tat Tvam Asi. So it's not that I am exclusively the one who is Brahma. One misunderstanding. And the third one is that your deepest self, Atma, is Brahma. This is called the supreme identity in the Indian tradition, that one's deepest self is identically the same. I trust everybody is clear about the difference between identity and equality. Maybe I give you an example from the history of physics here. At one stage, much to the surprise of great physicist Maxwell in particular, that the velocity of light was the same as the velocity of electromagnetic waves. So they ended up being equal. It was a surprise. But only when he was then able to postulate that light is itself an electromagnetic wave, then it is identically the requirement. So identity is something that is not accidentally happens to be equal. For example, I can put my hand in my left pocket and right pocket and say, oh, in both places I have 2 coins. Well, that happens to be equality by accident. But identity is not by accident. It is by its very characteristic of its being that it is the same. So when one says Atma is identically the same as Brahma, it's not just accidentally it happened to be so. That it is by its very structure, it is so. So this is the third one. And the fourth one is that consciousness. Actually, the Sanskrit word is pragya. It can be translated as integrated intelligence or as consciousness or sometimes even as wisdom. For example, Pragya Paramita is a great Buddhist text. It is often translated as wisdom from the other shore. So the word is difficult to translate this word, but the Sanskrit word is pragya. So these are the 4 what are called the Mahavakyas, the great enunciations in the Indian tradition. And then very much this suggestion, not suggestion, very strong remark actually, in both the traditions, that it is not easy to come to this level of finding one's oneness with the One. For example, Christ very strongly speaks about not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord, or in India, Hare Krishna goes on all the time. He repeatedly says, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will come to the kingdom of heaven. Here is a direct remark. He says, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my heavenly Father. You see, this is the requirement. But what is the will of the heavenly Father? Again and again, these sages say that strictly speaking, it can't be really clarified or said, but they give many suggestions. And always the call is more and more freedom from me, mine, my. Me, in one way or the other. I already quoted to you a remark of Christ, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. And a great text in India, Shatapat Brahmana, says when a person dies and knocks at the sun door, meaning wishing to come to the illumination, he will be asked, who is it? If the answer is anything other than nobody, he may not enter. So really the call very much is to become wholly free of oneself, complete freedom from myself, whereas the general human tendency is freedom for myself rather than freedom from myself. So one needs to be really very clear about what is the spiritual call. And partly because none of these teachings are easy. It's easy to quote Christ saying, love your enemies. Tell me any Christian who has actually succeeded in doing this. Similarly, many things that Krishna says, how can one so easily imagine that one can practice this? Now, here is a remark of Christ. This is not in a canonical gospel. This is in the Gospel of Thomas, non-canonical. He who is near me is near the fire. He who is far from me is far from the kingdom. So to come to the kingdom requires being near the fire, right? And even in the canonical Gospels, now let me tell you, what is the purpose of the John the Baptist or baptizer actually would be the right word, but he's often called John the Baptist. He says, this is his, you can read this in John's Gospel. I am baptizing you with water. Now, sadly, the usual translation is so that you may repent. The word which is being translated as repent is metanoia in Greek, which literally means to turn around, to make a 180-degree turn. So he says, I am baptizing you in water so that you may turn around. Then the one who is to come, for whose sake, for whose feet even I cannot touch. So he's referring to the coming of Christ. He will baptize you in spirit and fire. This is in the canonical gospel. He will baptize you with spirit and fire. Which is why this quote I just gave you from the Gospel of Thomas, non-canonical, he who is near me is near the fire. It's very easy to say, get baptized. 6-year-old kid, 8-year-old kid, hardly out of diapers, and say all kinds of things. Greek word for baptism is baptam, which literally means immersion in suffering. The whole New Testament is initially written in Greek. This is why I occasionally keep telling you what the Greek original of these words is. I'm not a Greek scholar, but I studied the gospel with a well-known Greek scholar, try to be clear about these words. So, in a way, none of these teachings are so easy as one might imagine. Simply saying, I just believe, is very easy to believe. But to actually follow the teachings of the Krishna or the Buddha or Christ, none of this is easy. And even this freedom from oneself is something very clearly understood, really. Here is the remark of Einstein. Hardly we regard him in the spiritual sages, but a great scientist. This is what he said. The true value of a human being is determined primarily by the measure and the sense in which he has attained liberation from the self. This is Einstein's remark. And you can find similar remarks actually made by Newton. All the great scientists are quite aware of their limitations of science. As I said the other day also, it's usually people who are not actually practitioners of science who think science is the only avenue to truth. Those who practice science are much more aware of its limitations because they can see in their own work how little they actually know about reality. For me personally, that was really the main driving principle, what drove me as a force from inside, moving away from continuing doing physics research. That is my background. Some of you probably know that. Because it was not really assisting me to understand who am I. And one can discover many things, whether we have 2 trillion galaxies or even 1 galaxy will do. Because from a spiritual point of view, none of them are against knowledge, but only that kind of knowledge has relevance from their perspective, which changes the quality of their being. So I often ask my physics friends whether E is equal to mc square or mc cube, how does it affect their life? But it has a great technical, you cannot have an atom bomb without the underlying theory of E equal to mc square. So it has obviously a great deal of relevance from human point of view even, but from the perspective of a spiritual search, what is the relevance of this? And it's rather interesting, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, this is in the 13th chapter, when Arjuna actually asks him, what is real knowledge or true knowledge? Krishna's response is very interesting. He describes only the kind of knowledge that has he's more describing the quality of the knower, and then he says, this is the true knowledge. Whatever changes the quality of the knower, that is the true knowledge, the rest is all false, he says. But then I think what is important for any searcher, and I repeatedly keep saying, I'm hoping, this is certainly my personal life's mission now, more or less towards the end of my life really, myself to be a searcher and assist my fellow, whosoever listens to me, to be a searcher rather than believing in this or that. Believing, don't need to be against believing if the belief helps you to be a searcher. For example, even in scientific research, it is a common belief that there is order in the universe. Nobody can prove this, but it assists scientific research because then they are searching for that order. So there is no reason to be against belief. But if belief replaces search, it is terrible. If it assists search, it can be helpful. So there is no reason to be against anything, as I keep saying repeatedly. Whatever can assist is fine. But I invite us all, including myself actually, to become more and more aware of the very large gap between what I know and what I am. I have read great scriptures. I have heard directly from great sages like Krishnamurti, from Jean de Salzmann, several Zen masters. But am I actually different? To become more and more aware of the large gap between what one knows and what one is a fundamental requirement for the journey actually to be taken seriously. Just to remind you of St. Paul, for example, saying, this is in the letter to the Romans, I do not do what I decide to do, what I wish to do. I find myself betraying myself. And later on, then he is able to say, first of all, he makes this remark, I die daily. People often don't seem to. Dying daily doesn't mean committing harakiri, but the call again and again to die to what I know, what I at present think I am, to be free of that. And then he is able to say, this is a direct quote again from St. Paul, I am crucified to the world, yet I live, but not I, Christ lives in me. See the shift from him saying he does what he doesn't want to do, and he does not do what he decides to do. I was actually struck, there is a 17th century French poet, Jean Racine. He had a little poem which had struck me, Lament of a Christian. This is his, I'll read this only in English here. My God, what a cruel battle. I find two men in me. One wishes to be filled with love for you, my heart always faithful to you. The other rebels against your will, my revolt against your law. But no point saying what anybody else says. Look within. If you are spiritually oriented, what does it actually mean? Do I actually carry out what I decide as a spiritual practice? Am I more and more free of myself? So to see the gap between what I know and what I am is a fundamental requirement for a searcher. Some of you, especially I say this for my friends from India here, I see Guru is here. People often forget Duryodhana, who is regarded as the bad guy in the battle in the Mahabharata. He actually ended up going to heaven before the Pandavas went to heaven. Partly because he was actually aware of his own inner situation. This is his remark in the Mahabharata, not coming from Arjuna, but from Duryodhana. For your sake, I say this in Sanskrit, okay? Janami dharmam na cha me pravritti, janamya adharmam na me cha nivritti. Tvaya rishikeshi hridayasthaya me yatha niyaktosmi tatha kuru. I know what is right, but I find myself not carrying it out. And I know what is wrong, but I find myself carrying it out. You, Krishna, who is seated in my heart, do with me what you wish. This is Duryodhana. Because Krishna actually is seated in everybody's heart, even in the heart of the devil. I often have to remind people, Satan was son of God. Particularly if you are interested, look at the book of Job. Twice, in the first chapter and the second chapter, it is said, when all the sons of God were gathered together, among them was Satan. He is also son of God. Actually, Lucifer was the highest angel of all the angels, just to remind you. But because of pride, he was expelled from heaven. If you are free of pride, you'll stay in heaven. So, Satan is also, and what is the function of the Satan I mentioned the other day? But each one of us, since the whole, in principle, according to all the sages, the entire external cosmos can be mirrored inside us. We are holograms of the whole cosmos. So why not the devil? Also God, to be sure. Both the divine side as well as the devilish side are within us. If you like more contemporary kind of language, we have a shadow side to our existence. This is the kind of language Carl Jung would use, for example. So both of them exist. And the devil side actually has more energy, more power. Some of you may be familiar with there is a whole great mythological story in India, churning of the Milky Ocean, which is actually churning of the ocean of consciousness. And there, the call is to invite both the demonic people as well as the divine people, the angels or the devas as well as the Daityas and Adityas are the two Sanskrit words, but it may be helpful for you to know both of them have the same father, Kashyap, which literally means vision. Daityas are children of Diti, is their mother, and their father is Kashyap. Kashyap, vision. Diti means limited, so they are children of limited vision. The other side is Adityas. Their mother is Aditi, which means unlimited vision. So they are children of larger vision. So there is always this struggle between children of larger vision and smaller vision. But within oneself, one would see that some things arise from small vision, limited vision, some from larger vision. But the call is to invite both of these because the Daityas have more energy, which is the reason, by the way, some of you know, Christ, for example, when he's being tested by the Satan, he doesn't ask him to go disappear or go to hell. He says, get thee behind me, Satan. Help from behind. He has more energy than most of these so-called good people do. Bad people have more energy, let me assure you of this. So how to include them has been one of the suggestions very much here. So very strong suggestion to be more and more free of what one is attached to or what one is concerned about, more aggrandizement, more approval, more wealth, more pleasure, all those things. And therefore, very much a suggestion to be, as I said, more and more really free of oneself. There is a great Sufi saying for centuries, if you die before you die, you will not die when you die. Any of the contemporary sages could say something like this. Krishnamurti often speaks words like this. You have to die to all you know, etc. But this is true throughout human history. call always is to be more and more free of me, me, me. And then whatever is real or true in me will survive. Then naturally, a fundamental requirement for any spiritual search is to be more and more clearly, impartially aware of what I actually am. How can St. Paul say that I try to do something, but I decide to do something, but I cannot do it? Because he's looking at himself impartially. So, impartial self-study or self-inquiry is the fundamental requirement for any spiritual undertaking. But I think I mentioned this the other day, that it has a danger of despair or fantasy. Despair simply because we take things personally. So if I see the negative aspects in me, then I think I alone am having this trouble. Others are free of it. But when one is working with other fellow searchers periodically, this is why a very strong recommendation, for example, particularly emphasized in Buddhist literature, Sangha. Sangha literally means community. And I may have mentioned this already. Even the word ecclesia, its Greek meaning is community of those who are called. But now it has just become meaning a church. Okay. That's the Greek origin of the word ecclesia. Community of those who are called. And really the suggestion is to periodically meet with people who are trying to follow a certain kind of search. Not everybody follows the same teaching. I have said that earlier more than once. Because we are not all called by the same teachings. We have different backgrounds, different language, different things emphasize people or strike people. But to find, for example, it's really simply seems obvious to me that a group of fellow searchers, to become a group of searchers, needs more or less a commonly respected teacher, a commonly respected text or sayings of the people. They may not be published in a text, but sometimes they are. But for example, if you're coming from the Islamic tradition, which could be a perfectly good group of searchers, they may not necessarily say, well, because the Bhagavad Gita says that, therefore, for them it may not be the relevant thing. Similarly, if you're coming from the Krishnamurti teaching, and that strikes you, you likely quote something from Krishnamurti to be helpful, but you don't necessarily, because the Guruji said something, that may not be so relevant from your point of view. So every searcher group requires, so it's not easy to form a group, I can assure you. Because within a group also people begin to argue with each other and everybody wants to be the leader. So thus it goes. But sooner or later, a group of people actually finds the necessity of listening more than advocating something or saying something adamantly. So, in any case, it's that can little bit free oneself from this despair that I alone is having this trouble. More than once I have said here that deeper knowledge of oneself is actually the knowledge of the human condition. It's not only the knowledge about Ravi, it's knowledge of the human condition. Because deep down, we come, purely give you a geometrical, if we are on the surface of a circle, one person can be at a long distance from the other, but closer inside, the circle becomes shorter and shorter. And the suggestion is that at the very center, we are all one. But that's merely a geometrical image. Don't get too attached to that. It's just that we have conveying something. That deeper one searches, closer one comes to everybody's internal nature. And then The other side is fantasy, as if I have been specially chosen to be the Son of God or something or the other, and the others can assure you you're not particularly chosen. That's actually more easily done. So, Swadhyaya, which simply means self-study, very soon begins to lead to this, I think I mentioned this already, important shift. Initially, following any teaching, I have this question, I have that question, but impartial self-study soon leads to I am in question. This is a very important shift. I have a question. The shift is towards I am in question. What in me stands in my way? What in me wishes to search for something? What can assist? What hinders? All that then begins to be. But you see, it becomes more and more an internal search rather than what has been discovered by the latest scientists today, which is all to do with external search. But sadly, much to my sadness actually, in the entire Bible, you can look at the whole concordance, there is not a single entry under self-knowledge. Hundreds of entries under belief or faith, some entries under knowledge, but not a single entry under self-knowledge. But non-canonical Gospels, which is why they are non-canonical, because they don't want to emphasize. Here is, I'll quote this actually from memory, because this is Gospel of Thomas. If you would know God, you must know yourself. Because the kingdom of God is within you as well as outside you. And when you know yourself, you will be known. And you will realize that you are the Son of the living Father. If you do not know yourself, you are in poverty. In fact, you are poverty. It's such a strong statement. In fact, I don't know any Indian version of this as strongly put as this. So, very strong emphasis on self. It is an absolute necessity. But here again, there is another thing which is important to understand. Again, I have probably said this more than once, that self-awareness or self-knowledge is intimately connected with self-transformation. It's very easy to verify this principle. For example, look at your breathing. Don't try to hold your breath. Don't try to artificially deepen it. But if you become aware of your breathing, the quality of your breathing will change. Awareness is the mechanism of transformation. So if you actually impartially watch yourself and see that I am greedy, slowly the greediness will decrease. Don't take my word for it. If it is true, it is true. If it is not true, you will soon discover it is not true. Personally, I actually do not know any other mechanism of transformation. Of course, classically, for example, in India, it is said, Vivekananda came to Ramakrishna and Ramakrishna touched him on the head and he was transformed. Well, maybe that is possible, but I haven't met anybody like this. I have been touched by Krishnamurti many times. I have not transformed. So I don't think this happens so easily, but it may happen. Personally, I do not know any other mechanism of transformation. If you know any, I'll be happy to learn. So let me simply repeat this. Awareness is the mechanism of transformation. So if I become self-aware, it will also bring about a transformation. But self-awareness, as I said, self-knowledge is a dangerous affair, but it requires help. So let me really bring this to a close here. But before I do that, let me remind you, Aldous Huxley, who was, by the way, fairly close to as a good friend of Krishnamurti. Some of you may know that. He wrote a very important book called The Perennial Philosophy. And ironically, in that perennial philosophy, he hardly quotes any philosopher. Because, as a good reminder from Krishnamurti, actually, that philosophy is love of wisdom, not love of thought. But he mostly quotes people who actually experienced something. So many of the mystics are there from all traditions. They're not exclusively Indian or anything. But quite ironically, at the end of this book, he does not give a summary of the understanding that he concluded. The summary is given by him. He wrote a preface for the translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Prabhavanand and Isherwood. So there he gives the summary of his perennial philosophy, ironically, partly because he says the Bhagavad Gita is the paradigm example of perennial philosophy. This is his remark. So it's a good idea for you to study the Bhagavad Gita. But he has 4 conclusions from perennial philosophy. I will read them to you. It's worth really pondering over all 4 of them, but I will stay with, can't have that much time. First, the phenomenal world of matter and of individualized consciousness, the world of things and animals and men and even gods, is the manifestation of a divine ground within which all partial realities have their being, and apart from which they would be non-existent. This is what I have been saying all along, that everything is created from the divine source, etc. That's what really all he's saying. Secondly, human beings are capable not merely of knowing about the divine ground by inference, that will be theology. They can also realize its existence by direct intuition, superior to discursive reasoning. This immediate knowledge unites the knower with that which is known. That is really more or less the meaning of love. I often, sometimes jokingly say, remind them from the Old Testament, or what the Christians call the Old Testament, actually it's the Torah. Adam knew Eve. Do you think this is without love? What kind of knowledge is this? Just sexual intercourse? So one needs to be understanding that the kind of knowledge which is being spoken about is bringing the 2 together. Patanjali actually emphasizes bringing 3 together. Knower, known, and knowing. 3 together. Samapatti is the expression he uses. But Huxley's conclusion is very much close to what Krishnamurti says. Observer is the observed. Third, man possesses a double nature, a phenomenal ego and an eternal self, which is the inner man, the spirit, the spark of divinity within the soul. It is possible for a man, if he so wishes, if so desires, to identify himself with the spirit and therefore with the divine ground, which is of the same or like nature with the spirit. Fourth, man's life on earth has only one end and purpose: to identify himself with this eternal self, and so to come to unitive knowledge of the divine ground. I have been saying exactly all this, but in slightly different terminology and giving references from the Bible or from the Gospel. But this is his summary of perennial philosophy. And I invite you all to think seriously about this. All the sages in all the traditions would more or less subscribe in slightly different terminology. Obviously, as I said, Christ is speaking to people of Jewish origin, speaking in Aramaic. The Buddha is speaking in Pali to people of Hindu origin. So the language is different, their racial background is different, their conditioning is different. So they understand things slightly differently. But much the same is being said by the sages everywhere. Next time onwards, I'm going to speak about some very radical differences in these two teachings. And those differences are arising from theology and philosophy. They're not arising from the sages. But it's the theology and philosophy that ultimately affects the whole culture. And particularly by the time it comes down to the masses, which is what the churches are interested in, by that time it is completely degenerated. So what the fundamental difference, maybe I should just mention it right now, many things follow from that. In India, there is, strictly speaking, no myth of creation. There is what one might say a myth of emanation. Brahma, which is the label for the highest reality, which simply means the vastness. Brahma did not create the world. The whole manifested universe emanated from the substance of the Brahma. And the classical analogy for that is in the oldest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Just as a spider web oozes out of the substance of the spider, then the spider can move anywhere on the web or even away from the web. So Brahma is not stuck in the universe. He can move away from the universe, but the whole universe is the substance of Brahma. And that has a very radical differences then. The other side, God created the universe, and no creator can be like the creator. Whereas in the Indian tradition, every creature, even the rock, has Brahma in it. So it's a very fundamental difference, and it leads to many, many differences. I was just told by Annie that there is a question or a comment on the chat, so please bring it.
From Jorge in Colorado, can Bhakti Yoga be used for self-transformation? If so, how?
Bhakti Yoga.
Oh, Bhakti. Well, first of all, Bhakti is frequently translated by people as love, forgetting that there is a very clear hierarchy in that expression. For example, Arjuna can have bhakti for Krishna, but Krishna does not have bhakti for Arjuna. So just to use the word love would not make any sense in this context, because the word bhakti also has a feeling of devotion or sometimes even celebration, but particularly devotion. And this is a little, first of all, maybe if you don't mind, I need to go into a slight more depth here. From the perspective of the teaching of Krishna or the Christ, it is much more important that we are loved by Christ than that I love Christ. Because and I invite you to look at it, several times, especially in the Gospel of John, I'm quoting remarks of Christ here. If you love me, you will obey my commandments. Then I will love you and will dwell in you as the Father dwells in me. Again and again, this is repeated by Christ. And let me invite you, you can look at all the 4 canonical Gospels. Nowhere does Christ say, I love God. What he says is, I obey God. One needs to be clear about this. There is a clear hierarchy. It's easy to say, I love this and this. But what does it mean? Just I invite you to consider if a father says to a young child, let us say 8-year-old kid, I love you, does it mean the same if the 8-year-old kid says to the father, I love you? Does it have the same implication? The trouble is with the language, because one word gets used for everything, so we shall say bhakti just means love. So one needs to be very clear about this, that although to be purely linguistically to be fair, that the word maybe I need to step back here even more. The word that is used for love in the Rig Veda is kama. By the time of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a few thousand years later, by the way, you should probably all realize when we say something is 2,000 years old here, in India it is considered recent. Different. So, according to recent Sanskrit, the word kama has now just become selfish desire or even selfish love. Same thing happened with the word eros in Greek. For example, Socrates makes this remark that any true philosophy can be done only in a state of eros. Or just to remind you, the first fohart in the book by Madame Blavatsky, Secret Doctrine, is eros. And that is actually coming, again, maybe this is helpful for some people. The preface to the Secret Doctrine is one of the suktas or one of the chapters from the Rig Veda called the Nasadiya Sukta, where the word kama is used. And HPB actually says that she's just describing in detail what is meant, what is in this sukta. The whole Secret Doctrine is an explanation of what is in the Nasadiya Sukta in the Rig Veda. This is according to HPB, not according to me. And there it is said that the kama is the first energy, or she would use the word first fohart, coming from the invisible to the visible universe, connecting it. So love is the translation for that. But by the time of the New Testament, eros acquired quite low-level meaning to this. So other words are required, like philia or agape. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. More murders every year there than anywhere else. You can check. But this is the meaning of the word philia, brotherly love. Agape is, strictly speaking, not brotherly love, but there the distinction I wanted to make between bhakti, the way it is used in the New Testament, both the disciples can have agape for Christ and Christ can have agape for the disciples. That is not true for bhakti. There it is much more clearly a hierarchical situation. But there is, in practice, or I already quoted to you from Christ, that there is a sense of hierarchy there as well. It is much more important that we are loved by God or by Christ or Krishna than that we love them. Because when I say I love God, I just have some idea what God is. I don't know what God is. Even the Buddha could not describe what nirvana is. Christ could not describe what is the kingdom of heaven. How would I know what God is? So there is some mental notion. And therefore always a suggestion that what is required is to be loved by the higher energy or higher sources than that I love them. So then Bhakti Yoga specifically is very much emphasized actually in the Bhagavad Gita, that ultimately thought cannot capture or come to God. It has to be through love. But love of the kind I just mentioned, not just loving that I love Krishna, that do I become worthy of being loved by Krishna? How do I become worthy of that? By in fact carrying out, as Christ says, unless you carry out my will, to say, Lord, Lord, that is not going to make you come to me. So there is the teaching, instructions, suggestions by these great sages. If we can carry them out, then we can be loved. Let me also remind you, especially the person who asked this question, the first 6 chapters in the Bhagavad, there are only 18 chapters. The first 6 chapters don't, only the very last verse in the 6th chapter has the word bhakti in it. Initially, the whole emphasis is on the right action and right knowledge, what gets called karma yoga and jnana yoga. Unless one has the right action and right understanding, notion that I love God is merely a fantasy. It's just coming from, driven by one's own desires, which is the one thing of which one needs to be free. This is the call. And maybe some of you, especially those of, I'm sometimes actually surprised my so-called Christian friends are not even familiar with some of the classical texts in Christianity. For example, the Cloud of Unknowing, or the Theologia Germanica, or the Philokalia, just as a simple reminder, first of all, that according to Martin Luther, a Christian needs to read only 3 books to be serious Christian. One is Theologia Germanica, the other is Letter to the Romans, the third is the Gospel of John. And as I said, most of my Christian friends have never even heard of Theologia Germanica. They are Christians, in quotation marks. But I invite you to actually read this carefully. But now I was especially going to speak about the Cloud of Unknowing, where very strong emphasis, it was written by an English author, but we don't know who the author is. Clearly some great sage. And their very strong emphasis that thought cannot lead one to God. This is the reason for the title of the book, that God is on the other side of the cloud of unknowing, and that only by love one can come to this. And Krishna also emphasizes this in the last chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. But to keep in mind, Krishna also says only those who know the truth can love me, and only those who love me can know the truth. It's a kind of a spiral nature. Truth cannot be obtained without love. But to say that I love without having any clear knowledge or clear understanding is just fantasy. Just one makes up something and one loves. So, I hope this is helpful what I said, but if anybody else wishes to add to this, or, yeah, please.
That quote I was going to say, the truth waits for eyes unclouded by longing, is what I wanted to tell you earlier. When you quoted Blake, I think that kind of encapsulates what you just said.
Maybe you can repeat it a bit more again so that it can be...
The truth waits for, I might be paraphrasing a little, but the truth waits for eyes unclouded by longing.
Blake was actually quite clear that if one knows something that truly, then it is like knowing the infinite. I think I earlier quoted from Blake. Also, just here to remind you why he was so upset with the idea that only science can lead to truth. He actually calls Newton, Locke, and Bacon as members of infernal trinity. This is William Blake. Locke was the philosopher who very much agreed with Newton. And Blake, maybe some of you, not Blake, Bacon was the president of the Science Council in England. So these are the three, he regarded them as members of infernal trinity. Okay. Anybody else wishes to bring something? Please do. Yeah.
Appreciate very much how you tie so many things together. So I wanted to ask you, a couple of days ago, you were speaking about the universes within us. Like we're one drop in the ocean, but the ocean is within us. And you said the universe is within us, the same the devil is also within us. And then you spoke today about the devil. With Jesus saying, Satan, get behind me. So what I wanted to ask you is, how can we get the energy? You said the devil has a lot of energy. How can we use the energy of the devil within us for good? How can we transform it?
Well, devil's energy, I think I gave this example even yesterday, that without a strong ego, it is not possible to really undertake any serious practice. So you can use the word devil, but we sometimes call egotistic tendencies, if you like, or even because any serious practice requires a kind of determination, not giving up easily. Yeah. Even if there are distractors, to hell with them, I'm going to stay here, whatever, you may use different expressions, but the point really to be made is again and again that it requires a very strong will. And here maybe I give you an example that might actually assist. This is a very classical example. Asmita, which is said to be one of the kleshas, klesha meaning a hindrance, an obstacle, according to Patanjali. It's in the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras where Patanjali says what we need is to cultivate samadhi, that's the goal of yoga, which is really freedom from myself. That's the way it's defined. You can check that third sutra in the third chapter. Swarup Shunya is the Sanskrit expression, freedom from oneself. And then, but he says the obstacles, the first one he mentions is asmita, which is almost always, literally it actually means I am this or I am that, because I am then isolating myself from the whole ocean of being. I could say I am a professor, forgetting that I'm also a father, I'm also a son, I'm also a brother, I'm also part of humanity. Everything else is forgotten. So that kind of identification with one thing limited is like limiting myself to a drop from the whole ocean of being. But then it gets translated as ego self or ego. But then, this might interest you, I was in Canada at that time wrestling with the Yoga Sutras. I get a letter from my brother, this is much before emails, that he's a professor of Hindi, or he's now passed away, but he was professor of Hindi literature, has written poems in Hindi, poetry books. He says, I have named my granddaughter Asmita. I was completely surprised. So I wrote to him, said, brother, that is supposed to be the great obstacle. Now, by the time this Sanskrit word comes into Hindi, Asmita is translated as self-confidence. The reason I am bringing this example, in fact, I strongly urge all the parents, particularly if they have young kids, never to try to remove their egotistic. They need a strong ego to have a strong self-confidence. You cannot have strong confidence without a strong ego. But then the suggestion is, this was quoted to me by John the Salesman. I didn't hear it personally, but apparently Gurdjieff used to encourage people who had weak egos to develop their egos, and then when it is developed, then to soak it into the water. That's how she quoted him. I don't know whether. So, in a way, strong ego is required to undertake any practice. Even wishing to be free of the ego requires a strong ego. This is the reason I mentioned yesterday, only the rich can practice poverty. The others are just stuck with poverty. They are not practicing poverty. The poor have no choice. Exactly the same. Do you think the Buddha could sit under a Bodhi tree for 49 days before a strong ego, without a strong ego? But then he's submitting the ego to the truth. That is it. That is the call, always. Thank you. Yes, sir.
interested in the connections that you made. I was interested in the connection you made between the cross and the vertical and the horizontal. Vertical being the personal and spiritual, and the horizontal being the communal and secular. But there is a contradiction there because vertical and horizontal are orthogonal to each other and therefore independent. But I guess it should be dependent on each other. So there is that dichotomy.
No, they can be independent of each other. That, for example, many of the great sages, Buddha is a good example, he moves away from the world, refuses to become the king. In fact, this has been one of my criticisms of the Buddha. Why won't he become also the king of this world, having become the king of the other world? But you see, in a way, there is a separation between the two. What I was more suggesting that we need to take care of both the sides. That is my understanding of the cross. I have never read any Christian scholars say that anywhere. But I don't wholly rely on these scholars. Christian scholars are mostly engaged. If I gave you examples of the kinds of things that whether St. Peter was left-handed or right-handed, these are the kind of, because he cut the right ear of one of the soldiers who came to catch Jesus. Then the next article, oh, well, maybe he came from the back, so he may be right-handed. This is what goes on in the theological literature. You may be surprised.
To go back to the comment that the lady made back there, it made me think of in the Bible, as you're constantly turning us back to the Bible, that negative energy is funneled in such a positive way when you think that Jacob was a dastardly guy. I mean, cheating his brother of his inheritance and had to leave town. And I mean, he was not a very admirable character. And yet, look at today. It's the children of Israel. I mean, he has his name changed because he had this transformation that you talk about. And you think of Paul, who's as Saul, was terrible to Christians, and yet he's the chosen vessel.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying made me think of that energy that's there. But when there's a transformation that takes place, it's a very positive force.
Well, that is really the call. If it was not positive from the perspective of these teachers, it wouldn't be worth having that transformation. Positive really more in the sense of becoming more and more closer to the divine. That is the call. And this, you see this not only, also with Peter, his name was changed from Simon to Peter, solid rock. Earlier he's just an ordinary person.
See, and that ties in with what you said, makes me think of when you're talking about, identity. You change your name because you're a different person. That transformation has taken place, as you said, purely in consciousness.
Yes. It's not that the person himself tries to change their name. The name is changed because the person is changed. It's the other people who are using the name. But these days we don't, even I can be called Ravi, which is hardly corresponds to what I am. That's quite different. Now it has just become a label, name label. But at one stage, the idea was that the name actually, in fact, it is still to some extent true among the indigenous people in Canada, that the name actually refers to their overall characteristic somehow. So change of name was indicating a change of the person, transformation of the person.
And maybe that goes back to what you started with, is the new birth.
Yes. Yes. It's certainly the new birth. It's very easy to see this in the case of Paul. He was going around actually trying to arrest or kill the Christians. Complete reversal, complete change. There is a big church in Damascus where all this took place, as you probably know, in Syria. We visited that many years ago. By the way, Syrian food is very, very lovely. That's the one thing that has stayed in my mind. Just ordinary. Okay, anybody else? I'm sure my partner Priscilla would agree with this too. We both very much enjoyed the food there.
You talked about, you talked about breath and breathing the spirit in oneself. And my question is, when one can no longer breathe for themselves, you said when the breath leaves the body dies, when one can no longer breathe for themselves and they have artificial oxygen moving through them, and if the oxygen is removed, the body dies. What can you speak a little bit about that? The one who's sustained by an external support system of breath?
I personally have no special experience of this, but my impression will be that when one is being somehow kept, the body is being kept alive by this artificial oxygenation, it is highly unlikely that one would have any quality of consciousness or thought about this. On the other hand, we should not imagine, after all, oxygen is also not created by us. I keep reminding people again and again that the air that we breathe is not created by us. So even the material that we can take from the atmosphere and then use it for some purpose is also coming from the same source from where our ordinary breathing comes. So whether it is actually able to assist people or not, or to what extent, I don't know. My impression is that consciousness is unlikely to be very clear with this kind of situation. But otherwise, if I can occasionally remind myself, these are just ways of really, all of us need periodic reminders to remember again and again that I did not create myself, that I am actually being breathed rather than saying that I am breathing. These are simple reminders, partly because it's difficult to disagree with these things. Yeah. And so they are, in that sense, factual reminders. And then naturally one wonders, the universe is so large, it could hardly be organized all around me. Why have I been created in this universe? So these questions, which are usually associated with spiritual questions, more likely arise or stay with us if we can remind ourselves of these obvious facts, which nobody could, even if some friends of yours who are against spirituality, they could hardly disagree with this. You can speak to them. So that's the reason I often sort of remind people. Yes, Maria.
Yes, I think that the idea of being breathed, if it's pondered, and it really helps us to realize that there's only one breath animating all life, and it helps us to remember how deeply connected we are with the life force and all other beings, and how much they all, deep within, have this sense of growth and expansion and happiness. That's being brought through, especially in the Buddhist tradition now. And I think it's timely, considering how abstracted we are from nature, even our children at this time.
No, I think it's a very helpful reminder, even actually in very ordinary scientific circles now. Each time, for example, any breath that I'm now taking, that particular air has been likely in the nostrils of many animals, many other human beings, some of them likely very good human beings. It has been in there. So it's a good reminder, certainly, of what you're saying, that we are much more, even purely organically, much more connected with, especially through breath. The same air has been, I occasionally even wish maybe it has been in the nostrils of the Buddha a long time ago. It came from, who knows? Why not?
Think big.
Fancy wish you're taking.
But you see, this is where also one needs to be careful, because to become worthy of this would require some practice on our side. Otherwise, one can just fantasize. Anybody else wishes to bring in? Yes.
Well, because it's St. Patrick's Day and I am Irish, I thought I would bring in a quote from Oscar Wilde, who said that if you want to be a greengrocer or a politician or a general, you invariably will become that, and that will be your punishment, if that's what you want.
So if you want to be a spiritual searcher, that will be a punishment.
To be freer from those things that we actually want to be. Yeah.
No, I think it is certainly generally actually suggested that if we keep coming back to a particular wish, it likely arises from slightly more deep within us if we are returning to this again and again, and that at least mentally would prepare us a little bit towards that. Now, whether this is sort of exactly so is hard to say, because many of these things cannot be, if you like, scientifically proved in 100% ways, but because many of these psychological, you encounter some people and you're touched by their presence. But it's very difficult to prove this to anybody else because they may not be touched by it. I was very struck, actually. A friend and I had gone to Chartres Cathedral on one occasion, which is probably the greatest Christian cathedral now still functioning. And there we were very surprised to see that there were big signs saying, "Beware of the pocket pickers." So now, obviously, even in that, near that cathedral, some people can feel, at least temporarily, almost transformed. They are touched by something deep. They become quieter. They even wonder about the remarkable, not just as the artwork, but what is behind this. But at the same time, there are people there who are picking pockets. Mm-hmm. So I was really quite struck by that sign, that right there, one has to be careful about pickpockets. Yeah.
This very thing happened to my friend recently who was feeding people on Skid Row. And the guy who he fed took his iPhone. And, it's just, that's just life, isn't it? You do a good thing, and right behind you, there's evil.
Yeah, so therefore to imagine that this cathedral will just transform everybody who comes there, this is the reason I keep reminding, the source has a quality, but the receivers also need some quality. The example that I have given maybe more than once here already, every member of the mafia reads the same Gospels as the John of the Cross. So the source is the same, but readers are different, and it's the same thing with the cathedral or with anything else. In the presence, again, I'm not sure really, but I imagine at least 10,000 people, maybe even more, had actually heard Christ in Jerusalem. How many followed him? A dozen and a half. So the source is the same. Anybody else wishes to? Anybody on Zoom here wishes to say something?
I'd like to say something, Ravi,
Yes.
but I cannot start my video because my computer is not spot that is. Unless he said,
No, it's okay. You can say it without the video.
okay, you had in the last 4 times you had the saying, also you did it now again. Obviously, I did not create myself. And I have a problem with that. Because you don't say what self did you have in mind? A little self, big self, the self in the Bhagavad Gita, or the mind self.
No, it's just
and
whatever
so-
I usually call Ravi, which is just the body and the mind.
Okay, that's. Are you sure about that?
Not a believer.
The other self that you are referring to is likely the one that has created this creature. The difficulty arises, and I think you're quite right for you to point this out, that the word self can mean many of these things. Self with a capital S, self with a small s.
Yeah, the Adi self, Adi Atman, 6 times in the Bhagavad Gita,
Yes.
the essence of the self,
Yeah.
or the Mahan Atma, self-creating self.
Yes. So, no, I think it's good to point all this out. But what I'm speaking about is really just simple, ordinary person sitting here. He didn't create himself.
Are you sure?
Well,
And in what context? How much is you involved and involved of other things that you are consider?
you see, in a way, you are already assuming or inviting a whole metaphysical perspective. What
Yes, I
am
do.
But that, therefore, one would obviously say that I am not only this body or this mind, but this is easier to say or to quote as you are doing right now. But do you actually are able to live from this other self? That is the actual practice of spiritual practice.
Yes, that's the hard work.
Because if one could live from that, then one would really very much come to precisely what Maria was pointing out already. One would see one's not only philosophical affinity with the others, but almost a biological affinity with the others. One would see that we have the same kind of consciousness pervading in all of us here. So one would already have a very different perspective on life.
That reminds me of the day that some are celebrating today. I'm not Irish. But St. Patrick, this gets back a little bit to what you were talking about before. St. Patrick had no inclination to serve the people of Ireland. In fact, my understanding is that he had been involved in a situation there, a war situation in which he had been taken prisoner and had a definite dislike for the ones that he was intended to serve. He refused the call for a very long time before he realized, I guess, by encounters with the one who speaks, that that's where he was intended to be.
Yes.
So refusing the call is something to ponder as well. How do we hear? And then how long may it take us to respond?
Let's take a minute or so of just quiet before we start. Thank you very much.